Tick tock, it's time to go. It is 7:30, so we're getting ready to start our next live review. Tonight we are doing time period 7. So I got a couple people, more people coming in. All right, that's awesome. So I lost track of time. I was actually watching another APUSH review on YouTube, and I tell you, this guy here, he had his review going on YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok, and I think one other site, doing it all at once. And I'm just like, I can barely keep up with this one right here. So more power to you, Tom Ritchie. You're the man. But anyway, we are going to start tonight, and we are doing time period 7, which covers essentially imperialism, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and World War II. So those are the big themes as we go through this unit. I did send out a text to my students if you're watching. One of the problems I think I realized that I didn't realize, but I just found out today when another student was talking to me, is if you're using your school-issued devices, you are not going to be able to use the chat window in YouTube because Northside they've set it up where they don't allow that to happen, So if you ever want to do the chat, you've got to be on your own personal device. So that pretty much cleared that up for me. So I don't feel as bad that you guys aren't talking to me. I understand it a lot more now. So, all right, I've wasted enough of your time just chattering. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And like I said, that got shifted a little bit. Like I said, we are starting with time period 7 tonight. Time period 7, and this is going to be off tonight because I just realized that this is not set up correctly, but that's all right. We'll just suffer through it. I'll move anyway. We're in time period 7, 1890 to 1945. And like I said, imperialism, progressivism, global conflict, depression, all of that is in here. And when we start to look at this, basically, let me move myself out of the way. Let me get myself out. Let me just fix this, guys. I'm sorry. I had this set up before, and then I started doing other stuff. All right, that should be a little bit better, and I'll make myself a little smaller. There we go. All right, so here are the timelines that are basically covered in this time period. And I have it set up as 3 separate timelines, and this is really how I would look at this time period if I were you. Look at it in chunks. So this first timeline is going to cover essentially imperialism and the progressive era. And that goes from 1890 to about 1929. And you got the Roaring Twenties in there as well. But then the big shift is going to happen in 1929 with the Great Depression. The stock market's going to crash. Everything, we're going to go into this depression for the next 11, 12 years. That's a whole nother topic of study. And then there'll be another shift starting in 1939 with the start of World War II. So if you kind of break it down this way, it's a little bit more manageable. Unit 7 is a fascinating time period because this is when America comes into her own. I talked this afternoon about how time period 6, the Gilded Age, is when America is essentially starting to establish herself as a dominant power in the world economically, and the things that happened during the Gilded Age carry over into time period 7 and affect what goes on during time period 7. And you'll see that especially right here at the beginning of our discussion. So we're going to start with big idea number 1. And again, I apologize for this. Very poor. This sucks. I hate this. If it's not right, I just can't focus. There we go. There we go. Time period. Big idea number 1 is about imperialism. Essentially what happened, and we know this happened in time period 6, 1890 marked the closing of the Western frontier. Frederick Jackson Turner came out and said the frontier is closed. We can't expand anymore. Well, the problem is, we are a nation that likes to expand. I mean, expanding and going west and going into new lands, that's always been part of our characteristic. So when the frontier was closed, well, that's really no problem. We're going to start looking overseas to where we can start expanding, because that's what Turner was basically saying, is that we are a nation that just naturally looks to expand. And that's in our DNA. So we'll start looking overseas to where we can go. And that's we're going to look at the causes of that, or the driving forces behind that. And essentially economics was number one. We're starting to look for new markets. I mean, we're coming out of the industrial age of the Gilded Age, and during the Gilded Age, we turned into this huge industrial power where we're producing all these new goods. Well, we need places to sell those goods. And so new economic markets, we're looking for those as we go into this time period. Alfred Thayer Mahan came out with a book who basically said, the influence of sea power on nations. And his thesis was that great nations are built on the back of great navies. If you don't have a strong navy, you are not going to have a strong nation. Well, as we've grown, we are wanting to build our strength as a nation, especially now that we're looking into overseas trade and overseas markets. We need our trade to be protected throughout the world. So we're going to start building up our navy so we can become a stronger nation. And so part of our expansion into the world is looking for new areas that we can build new naval bases. Because we just can't send a ship out and say, well, you're on your own. You got to have rest areas along the way, essentially. And so that was another driving force behind imperialism. And then finally, social Darwinism. As Americans, we felt, not just Americans, but Western Europeans too, together we felt that it was our responsibility to go in the world and make sure the world is civilized. Now, that's been part of the DNA of America since the beginning. I mean, the Spanish wanted to civilize the Native Americans. As we went through our growth as a nation, we were always looking for a new Native American policy, hoping to civilize them, hoping to assimilate them into our culture, teaching them, quote, the right way to live, end quote. And it's no different here with imperialism. We're going to go out into the world and we're going to go into all these, quote, backwards nations, and we're going to show them the correct way to live and that Western influence. So that was another motivating factor behind imperialism. Well, all this is going to lead to our first real encounter under this umbrella of imperialism, which is the Spanish-American War. It started, honestly, with the explosion of the USS Maine that was docked in Havana, Cuba. Now, the ship was docked there because it was there to protect American economic interest in Cuba. But when the ship blew up, and we'd always had our eye on Cuba, when the ship blew up, we used that essentially as a motivation or a reason to declare war against Spain. And the Spanish-American War is going to be fought over the next several months. We said at the very beginning we didn't want Cuba. That was the Teller Amendment. Once the war was done and the Treaty of Paris of 1898 is signed, we're going to sign the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment is essentially going to make Cuba a directorate of the United States. We're going to kind of be like Big Brother to Cuba in the years going forward. But it wasn't just about Cuba, because as a result of the Spanish-American War, we got other new territories such as the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, and so we're getting these new markets and everything. Now the question is, how do we deal with new territories that are under the American flag? And so you're going to have this huge debate during this time period between the anti-imperialists and those who want to start annexing a lot of these nations or a lot of these territories into our country. The Philippines is the perfect example of this. The Philippines, when we first gained control of the Philippines as a territory, we didn't want to give them their independence because we felt that they were not equipped to govern themselves. So some people were pushing for us to annex the Philippines into our country, but the anti-imperialists were going to have a staunch argument against that, saying, there's a lot of different reasons why. So you want to make sure you know the arguments that the anti-imperialists had, and a lot of it had to do with self-determination, which was also one of our key founding ideals, is the ability of people to be able to choose their own government. And we weren't giving that to those in the Philippines. So this was our foray into imperialism, and it's going to also be our launching point into the world as a world power. Now, we don't start off as a world power, obviously. We are still trying to maintain some isolationism here, but isolationism doesn't essentially connect to economic growth. So while we're not going out and trying to militarily rule the world, if you will, we are starting to put ourselves out there a lot more than what we had previously. Now, before we go any further, we got to talk about changes that were going on here in our country. I said last night when I was doing time period 6 that I would talk about the progressive era tonight. As we were going through the Gilded Age, the Gilded Age was wonderful as far as America was concerned economically on a whole. But when you started to drill in deeper, you realize it's called the Gilded Age because all of that wealth was covering over or clouding over a lot of problems that we had in our country. And so the progressive era is going to be a response to all the problems that were within our society during the Gilded Age. And those problems were caused by our rapid rise of industrialization. It was caused by the growth of our cities and a lot of the corruption that started to breed in these scenarios, because remember, our government was practicing laissez-faire at this time. So corruption bred quite easily. We're going to start learning about the problems through the muckrakers. And obviously the most well-known muckraking work is The Jungle, which exposed the meatpacking industry. And as a result, these muckrakers, these journalists who are exposing corruption and problems in our society, they're going to start introducing all these problems. And the more we learned about these problems, the more we wanted to deal with these problems. And it's interesting because we did not look to necessarily the government to fix everything. You started seeing individuals and groups step up to start working towards change. And the perfect example of that is Jane Addams. Jane Addams is going to introduce the Settlement House program, which was a movement to provide help to those who are in poverty, provide help to those who are looking for job, immigrants, people trying to learn English, women who are trying to either get in the workforce or get educations and stuff like that. So they're trying to help society from the ground up. And that's kind of what you're going to see throughout the late 1800s going into the 1900s. That doesn't mean that the government was not involved in reform, because the government had to get involved in certain areas. I mean, The Jungle introduced us to the meatpacking industry and all the nasty stuff that was going on. So you are going to see the government start passing laws for food safety. Because of the work of the muckrakers, you're going to see the government also start passing child labor laws. They're going to start looking at the structure of these businesses, these monopolies that are forming, and realize we got to do something about that. So when you look at everything that happened during the Gilded Age, there's going to be a response to that in the early 20th century. And that's that cause and effect relationships that I've been talking about a lot. And so make sure you kind of understand the flow of time, if you will, to see how one thing led to another. Another thing that was introduced during the Gilded Age is going to be the populist movement. And the populist movement is going to have a very specific platform called the Omaha Platform. And several key components of that called for the direct election of senators, called for an income tax, called for labor union rights, like a shorter workday, an 8-hour workday, and minimum wage and stuff like that. And though the populist movement didn't go beyond the 1890s, the ideas continued into the 20th century. So we'll see the passage of the 17th Amendment, which was the direct election of senators. I don't have it up there, but the 16th Amendment was the income tax. And so that's change that's coming from the Gilded Age as well. The women's suffrage movement, go all the way back to 1848, go all the way back to the reform movements of the 1830s, and you started seeing women's movements start to gear up. And build and build throughout the 19th century. And then finally in the 20th century, at the end of the progressive era, the 19th Amendment is finally passed, giving women the right to vote. So you can kind of see, when you start looking at all these together, how history flows and how it continues and how it answers problems of the past with solutions of the future. And then we create more problems and then more solutions. And that's pretty much the flow of history. The progressive presidents, TR, Taft, Wilson, all had key roles in a lot of the changes that were made. The biggest thing is what we saw with the progressive presidents is they expanded federal power. It's interesting, the further we go in history, our presidents more and more find ways to expand federal power. Go back to Jackson. He's known for expanding the power of the presidency. You can make the argument that Lincoln did a little bit of the same during the Civil War. Now we got the progressive presidents of the early 20th century doing the exact same thing. Okay? All right. I had meant to get rid of that slide. All right, big idea number 3. Let's get to World War I. World War I is going to come into play in the early 19-teens. The war actually starts in Europe over in 1914, but America is not going to enter the war until 1917, kind of in the fourth quarter of the game. And what's going to spur American involvement in the war is several key events. The Lusitania, everyone always talks about the cruise ship. Now, I'm going to caution you here. The Lusitania, this absolutely gained attention to what's going on, but the actual sinking of the Lusitania is not a direct cause of World War I, because that happened in 1914, and we don't enter the war until 1917. But that memory lingers in our head, because then what starts happening is the Germans start practicing unrestricted submarine warfare. And the Lusitania was a victim of that. And then as we go into the 1915s, 1916s, 1917, American vessels are being attacked under the unrestricted German submarine warfare. So that is the cause of American entry in the war, is that submarine warfare used by the Germans. The Zimmerman telegram is another cause of World War or United States entering. And if you remember correctly, the Zimmerman telegram was a proposal by Germany to Mexico to try to start a war with the United States to keep us busy over here, so we didn't get involved in the war over in Europe. And so that's going to draw our attention, and that's going to lead us to declaring war against Germany. Now, Wilson is going to argue, when he asked for his war declaration, he's going to argue that we got to go and make the world safe for democracy. Wilson believed in moral diplomacy. He believed that the best way for America to serve the world is to spread democracy everywhere. And so when he saw what was happening over in Europe, he said, what we need to do is we need to go over and fight, so that way self-determination, or the ability of the people to choose democracy, is going to be the reason we're fighting. However, back here at home, during his presidency and during our involvement in the war, he's going to pass the Espionage and Sedition acts. And these were very similar to what we saw with John Adams when he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The idea was these laws are being passed to limit dissent, to limit complaints, or to limit protests against American involvement in the war. And to understand that, the one Supreme Court case you might want to jot down in your notes somewhere is Schenck versus the United States. Be familiar with that one court case there. Now, the outcome of the war, we win, or, the Allies win and America comes home the victor, but Wilson is going to go to Europe to help negotiate the peace. And what he's going to introduce is his 14 points. These were basically his outline for what world peace could look like if we took all of these steps. And everything you looked at in those 14 points kind of reflected all the reasons why we entered the war, freedom of the seas being one of them. But the big caveat, the big, oyster pearl in the whole set of the 14 points is the introduction of the League of Nations, a global body that would prevent another world war from happening, that would create an alliance between all the global powers, where we would have each other's backs and we would prevent anything from ever happening like what we just went through. The problem was the United States government, meaning the Senate, was not ready to accept the League of Nations. And when the Treaty of Versailles, and just for those of you who still don't remember, the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that was signed to end World War I. The Treaty of Versailles created the League of Nations. The United States rejected that treaty because we did not want to be part of an alliance. We did not want to give up any of our sovereignty or any of our power to a global authority. And so that's why we didn't enter into the League of Nations. However, the League of Nations still forms. It doesn't have the oomph that it needs, though, because the United States is not part of it. Okay? All right, moving on. Big idea number 4, the Roaring Twenties. When we're talking about the Roaring Twenties, we're going to see a post-war economic boom in our country. And you're going to have a lot of people, with a lot of disposable income because we weren't spending as much during the war. You're going to see introductions of new forms of production like assembly lines and stuff like that. So we're going to see new products being mass produced. And not only that, they're going to start marketing all of these new items. Marketing is becoming a new function of the American economy. Advertising is what I'm talking about. And what we're going to see is a rise of consumerism. We've become a nation of consumers where we're trying to get the latest, greatest gadget on everything. And we've never looked back. We're going to see culture change during the 1920s. Women are going to basically explore their independence. Young women especially. Young women are going to be saying, kind of throwing off that cult of domesticity, and they're saying, hey, I want to go out and go into the working world. It's a temporary thing. I don't want you to think that women are going out and establishing their independence and, just breaking away from the family life and everything, because the goal is honestly in the 20s to go back to the family life, but they want to have their young independence. They want to sow their wild oats, for lack of a better term. They want to go and earn their own money. They want to experience, life, if you will, away from the control of their fathers or away from or before they get under with their husbands and stuff like that. This is where you're going to see the rise of the flappers. The flappers are going to be part of the 20s culture that I think we always see. The young women with the short bobbed haircuts, and the shorter dresses, just dancing and having fun and partying and everything like that. So that's kind of the image we get when we think of the 1920s and culture, but there was so much more. I think one of the major cultural movements during the 20s is the Harlem Renaissance. During World War I, there was a great migration of African Americans leaving the South, moving to the cities for the jobs that the war presented. And so as they moved to the cities, they started to form their own neighborhoods and their own cultural centers in the North. And in Harlem, New York, that's going to kind of become the center of African American culture in our country. And you're going to hear poets like Langston Hughes and jazz music and all this coming out of Harlem. And it's going to start to spread to the country. And, so we're going to start to see African American culture become part of American culture during this time. Not everybody liked it. There were still social tensions. You still, actually going into the 19th or 20th century, you had a resurgence of the KKK. And that's going to be, and they're going to push back against everything. And it's not just the KKK located in the South. They are spreading throughout the entire country. They're also trying to get into public office and stuff like that. Immigration is still considered a problem. We came out of the 19th century into the 20th century with this huge wave of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. And there's still fear about, communism and stuff spreading here. And so you're going to see immigration quota acts being put into place. The government's going to start doing that. And we're going to have essentially the first Red Scare during the early 1900s, where we are fearful that communism and socialism is spreading in our culture. And so the government's going to get involved to try to rid us of those influences. And that all ties back to immigration, which ties back to the Gilded Age, because this wave of immigrants started in the latter half of the Gilded Age. And the immigration grew due to the rise of industry growing and all the jobs being offered. And so again, there's that flow of history. More jobs, more opportunity, more people coming into our nation and bringing their ideas and their culture. And that's a threat to America, the American, culture that as we saw it. So that's going to lead to the Red Scare. And that's going to lead to the nativism. That's going to lead to the government taking action, passing the Quota Acts, the Emergency Quota Act of 21 and the National Origins Act of 1924. Okay? You're also going to see our culture be challenged with, with the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial is going to be focused on the rise of this idea of the theory of evolution. And so you're going to see that come to light and come to the forefront of the American stage in the Scopes trial in Tennessee. And so make sure you're familiar with that as well going forward. All right. I'm going into the weeds a lot with this. I'm supposed to be doing this quickly. So, all right. That takes us to the Great Depression, big idea number 5. Now, The Great Depression is going to hit in 1929. And a lot of people want to say, okay, it was the stock market crashing that causes the Great Depression. The stock market crashing was a result of the other causes of the Great Depression. Speculation. We were spending a ton of money during the 1920s, and we were using that money to invest in the stock market. And we were overbuying. We were basically, when people start buying stock, that drives the value of the stock up because people think, oh, there must be something special about that stock because everybody's buying it. And so the price goes higher and higher and higher because demand leads to increased prices. Well, people were buying so many stocks that the price kept going higher and higher and higher. And the companies that the stock was being bought from, they weren't making that kind of money. They couldn't maintain that value. And so what's going to happen is this over speculation is happening across the board. If it was just one company, if everybody started buying Apple computers and that's the only stock everybody was buying and Apple computers crashed, it might hurt a little bit, but it's not going to cause a resounding, or a devastating result. But when across the board people are investing highly and overbuying the stock because of speculation, that's going to drive prices down. The speculation is also going to cause the Great Depression because people were borrowing money to buy these stocks. That's buying on credit, taking out loans really started big time during the 1920s for the everyday consumer. I mean, we've seen it before in the 1900s and stuff, but in the 1920s, it was rampant because that capitalism that we fell in love with of the 1800s, when we see the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, we want to be like them. And so we're investing, we're trying to buy more and more. And we go and borrow money thinking, oh, I'll make a fortune and pay it back tomorrow. Well, tomorrow comes and your stock is worth nothing. And now you can't pay back your loans. And then when people can't pay back their loans, the banks are weakened because they've been loaning all this money to people who can't pay it back. That ends up with banks being closed. And so, or banks closing down. And so it was the perfect storm of a lot of economic problems coming together at once. This is when we really first started looking at the government saying, fix it, do something with this. And Hoover, coming up from, time periods of, the Panic of 1893, the Panic of 1873, when the government just kind of took a step back and said, well, it'll take care of itself. He kind of took that same response. He's like, it's not the government's job to fix all of these economic problems of the American people. And so he doesn't really have a response. The only response he has was he passed a higher tariff to try to increase American industry. And it was the Holy Smoot tariff, which was an absolute failure. He also had a failure with soldiers from World War I who came in and who had been promised a bonus on their return. The bonus was to be paid off in 1939, 20 years after the war, but they want their money now because they're losing everything, and he doesn't pay them back. And so that's going to end up into a big conflict on the grounds of the Capitol building where, the military is going to be sent in to disband this protest and people are going to get hurt, someone's going to get killed. Just not a big thing. So when Hoover runs for re-election, guess what? He loses. FDR comes in, and FDR is going to introduce what's known as the New Deal. The government is going to get directly involved in trying to fix the economy. Now, we can argue to the cows come home whether or not the New Deal got us out of the Great Depression. I'm just going to tell you, it did not, but it got us through the Great Depression. The government's going to introduce a number of programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and these were meant to provide temporary jobs, temporary solutions to help people get through, to give people hope. You're also going to see some permanent structures being implemented, such as the Social Security system and FDIC, the insurance corporation that insures our monies in the bank. Now, if you go into a bank and you deposit money, if that bank closes, that money's insured. You're not going to lose all your money. So that's the kind of stuff that FDR did during the New Deal. Not everybody was happy with that. You're going to have challengers. Huey Long is one of the big ones who challenges it. He says the government's not doing enough. The government should do so much more, and he believed in a wealth redistribution program in where he's going to take all the money from the rich and he's going to give it to everybody else. and he's going to give a car to everybody. He's going to give a house to everybody. He's going to give a radio to everybody. And it sounds real good on the surface, but you do the math and you realize that that's just not going to work. You can take all the money from the rich, but once you take all the money from the rich don't have any money anymore. So how do you keep dispersing that? But Huey Long provided this pie in the sky attitude, but he wasn't the only one. Father Coughlin was another one who argued against FDR and his plans. They didn't think he was doing enough. The government, the Supreme Court's not going to be too happy with FDR because they're going to rule several of his programs unconstitutional. When that happens, FDR's like, well, dude, I'm just going to go ahead and make the court bigger, and I'm going to get some justices in there that will support my programs. And it's called the court packing scheme. And he came up with this elaborate plan that they were going to add something like 9 justices to the Supreme Court based on the age of the existing justices. And of course, if whoever the president is, if they need new justices on the Supreme Court, they appoint them. So FDR's plan was, I'm going to appoint people who will basically support everything I do and not declare anything unconstitutional. Well, Congress saw right through that, and they're like, yeah, we're not playing that game, dude. And it didn't pass. But that's essentially what was going on during this time. That's going to take us to big idea number 5. And here we go. World War II. World War II is essentially going to be what gives us an economic boost to get out of the Great Depression. Now remember, we had been an isolated nation from way back when. Go back to Washington's proclamation of neutrality. And we have stayed pretty much isolated. After World War I, we went back to isolationist principles. Now, we weren't totally isolated, but essentially during the 1920s, we weren't getting involved. We weren't in the League of Nations. I mean, that's a perfect example of a continued isolationism. But as the war gets started over in Europe, FDR sees the writing on the wall, and we're going to have the Neutrality Acts are going to be passed, but we're also going to see ways around the Neutrality Acts like Lend-Lease and Destroyer for bases and cash and carry. All that stuff is going to be put into play. So we start getting involved in the war early, although we're not fighting in the war. What's going to pull us into the war drastically, obviously, is going to be the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That's one of those dates, guys, you got to absolutely know. December 7th, 1941. And we are going to go into a total war posture in our country. Everybody in the country, from the smallest of kids to the oldest of men and women, were expected to contribute to the war effort. If they couldn't fight, they should ration. If they were not only rationing, they should plant victory gardens. We need to save everything because we can't spend anything because everything has to go to the war effort. And we're fighting a two-front war. We're fighting in the Pacific and we're fighting in Europe. Here on the home front, like I said, everyone contributes. Lots of jobs opening up with all the men left. Now, we saw this in World War I, but World War I was a much shorter war compared to World War II. So when the women started going into the factories, they weren't going in for about 10 months like we saw in 1918 and 1919. They were going into the factories for almost 4 years. And they were building everything that we were using in this war. And the symbol of women in the workforce during World War II is Rosie the Riveter. And she is that symbol of women and their contribution to the war. But it wasn't just in the factories. Women were serving in the military as well. You know, you had the Women's Air Corps. You had the women who were in the Navy. You had, I mean, they were involved in everything. Here the other thing we had to deal with here is the fear of the enemy we're fighting. Now, we've seen the Red Scare before and all that other stuff, but when the Japanese attacked us, we had a fear of the Japanese Americans living here. We thought they were spies. So FDR is going to pass Executive Order 80. I can't remember. It's like 8022. Don't hate me. And basically took all Japanese Americans, specifically on the West Coast, and put them in internment camps, saying we don't feel comfortable because they might be spies. Now, a man by the name of Fred Korematsu, in the Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus the United States, is going to sue, saying he was unjustly and illegally arrested, if you will, or detained, he is going to lose that case. And that kind of falls under the same reasoning as the Espionage Acts and the Sedition Acts and stuff like that. When we are at war, the Supreme Court tends to always rule in the restriction of American rights as a necessity. And that's how they ruled here. They ruled against Korematsu. Other minorities were involved in this war as well, though. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, all involved in fighting in this war. African Americans, when they got over to Europe, they realized that we're over here, we're fighting for the democracy and the freedom of all these peoples over here, but we don't have those same freedoms back home. And that's going to be the basis of the WWII campaign. Victory at home and victory in Europe and then victory at home. It was a pledge that once this war was over, we're not going back to the status quo. We're going to go back and we're going to fight for civil rights in our country. We're going to fight for the freedoms that we're fighting for over here in Europe for other people. Because they're still segregated at this point. Now, it's a little bit different than World War I, because in World War I, segregated and African Americans could not fight in any battle units. That's not the case during World War II. In fact, you're going to see one of the most highly decorated units, the Tuskegee Airmen. They're going to be fighter pilots who have one of the best kill ratios in the air of any other air unit in the Army. So there is some change, but it's not enough, and that's the basis of the WWII campaign. I mean, I can go into a lot more detail. I can talk about how FDR desegregated the defense industries during the war, and that's also going to spur more fights for civil rights. So use World War II as a pivot point, if you will, for the civil rights movement. It doesn't mean that the civil rights movement started with World War II. I mean, it started all the way back in 1865 with the Freedmen's Bureau, but World War II is going to give it a boost. And we're going to see as we go into the late 40s and into the 50s, that's when you're going to see the civil rights movement really taking off. At the end of this war, America is going to declare its superpower by dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The one and only time an atomic bomb has been used in war, and we are the only country to use it. We developed it, but what that's going to do is while it launches us, see the pun there? It launches us into the world as a superpower, it's also going to launch the next unit, which is going to be the Cold War. Some questions you might want to ask yourself as you're studying, and you want to, I'll leave these up for a second, but what motivated U.S. imperialism? The goals that defined our progressive reformers? How did World War I affect civil liberties? And that's that Schenck case that you should look at. How did the New Deal change government? And I'll give you the bottom line. It made government bigger, and it injected government into our daily lives. That wasn't the case prior to the 1930s. Government was seen, or was known about, but we didn't see it. And so, but that changes with the New Deal. And then finally, how did World War II reshape our country, and then also reshape our role in the world? So those are the questions you should ask yourself with regards to this unit. I think that's the end of my slideshow. I'll leave those questions up just for a minute if you want to write those down. Let me check here. I don't think I got any text messages for questions or anything. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm assuming you guys are all good, or you are on your school-issued devices and you can't ask questions. So this is where we're going to leave it tonight. I went a little bit longer than I wanted to. I always said I wanted to keep it under half an hour, and I talked too much. Hush. And Flynn is ready to get my attention, so he's telling me time is up. So all that said, I will, in case you can type some questions in there, I'll leave it up here for a minute. If you would please, I know I hate doing this because it sounds like I'm pandering, but if you can, give me a like or give me a subscribe on these, because that will help get this out here and get more people watching and stuff like that. I will say that tomorrow night I will be on, and we're going to, about the same time, 7:30, and we're going to talk about time period 8. And then I'll take Wednesday night off. Thursday I will be on for my long-term review. If you're going to plan on watching Thursday night, I would definitely say get off of your school-issued devices and get on your personal devices so you can ask questions, because that's going to be what drives our review. If you don't want to watch me, I'm just going to give a plug for Heimler. He is on Wednesday night and Thursday night. He is doing his live reviews. Wednesday night, he is doing time periods 1 through 5. Thursday night, he's doing time periods 6 through 9. I believe he starts, I want to say it's 6 o'clock our time. I might be wrong. You can double check that. Go to his page and check that out. Tom Ritchie is doing live reviews every night as well, so you might want to check him out on YouTube. If you guys know of anybody else who's doing live reviews, share them with us, because you know, the more viewpoints you get, the more you're going to learn. So, okay, so that's what we have for tonight. I'm going to say good night. I hope you have a great evening. Tomorrow night, oh, you're very welcome. Tomorrow night you will be with me again for time period 8. And I might throw in a little bit of 9 just because I'm not doing an individual night for time period 9, so I might touch on that briefly. But other than that, you guys have a fantastic evening. We will see you tomorrow, and go study. Bye-bye.